And really, not having these conversations brings a whole host of challenges, right? And you alluded to some of them.
Welcome to the Live Greater View, a financial planning podcast produced by VLP Financial Advisors that discusses life, money, and perspective. We help clients live their best life at every stage through our VLP Live Greater partnership process. Thank you for tuning in.
Welcome. So today we have a great episode topic, essential money talks with family, and a great guest today, Cameron Huddleston, who also wrote a book, which we'll talk a little bit about, and really the essential money conversations you need to have with family.
Yeah, I met Cameron a few years ago when she interviewed me for some varying things she was writing on. And then she contacted me and said, "Hey, I'm writing this book." I said, "Well, what is it about?" And she said, "It's about money talks with your elder parents." And I said, "Wow, this is a great topic." We're constantly having conversations around this with our clients who have older parents, and even our clients who are the older parents, saying, "Hey, what are your kids thinking about?" So we just thought it'd be a really good idea to have Cameron on today, talk about what she's learned about the book and things she learned along the way, just personally and writing the book. So the book is called "Mom and Dad, We Need to Talk: How to Have Essential Conversations with Your Parents About Their Personal Finances." And we regularly give the book to clients, and there's one in the background. Rose just showed one. So just to get started, Cameron, just give us a little bit of your background and what was sort of the antithesis of why you wanted to write a book, because it's not easy.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me on. So I have been a personal finance journalist for more than 20 years. And I actually was being interviewed on Experience podcast. I was at a conference and they were interviewing some of the attendees, and we were talking about an article that I had written about how I had helped my mom manage her finances when she had Alzheimer's disease. And there were two hosts, one man who was younger than I am, one who was older, and both of them said, I need to talk to my parents and get some information about their finances in case I ever have to step into a role like you have. The person who was recording the podcast came up to me afterward and said, "Hey, I think I need to talk to my parents." There was another person in the room. Everyone there said to me, "I think I need to talk to my parents because I might end up in a situation like you're in." And that is when the light bulb went off. I thought, you know what? I need to write a book to help people realize they need to have these conversations and to guide them through the conversations, because the truth is, I did not have detailed conversations with my mom about her finances before she started experiencing memory loss. Like I said, I'm a personal finance journalist, but I didn't realize this was something I needed to be talking to my mom about. I had a general sense of where she stood financially. I had had a conversation with her before she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's about looking into getting a long-term care insurance policy. She did take my advice. She reached out to an insurance agent, but she couldn't get one because of another pre-existing condition she had. And, of course, looking back now, I'm thinking, oh, that would have been a great opportunity to have that conversation, to say to my mom, okay, you can't get long-term care insurance. Let's talk about how you would pay for long-term care. If you needed it, let's talk about what sort of care you would want. But I didn't. I totally dropped the ball. And so then when she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, I had to scramble to get the information I needed to make sure all of her estate planning documents were updated. And luckily, because I am a personal finance journalist, I knew what steps to take. But I know a lot of people don't, and no one teaches you these things. And if you haven't taken the right steps, then you might find yourself unable to step in and help your parents when they need your help the most. And so that was why I wrote the book, and that's what guided me through the book as I was writing it.
What particular things or who did you reach out to help, even though you had all of this personal experience? Were there additional people that helped you along the way as far as attorneys and things like this? But what were some of the conversations that you think are essential to have with your parents as well?
So definitely I, put on my journalist cap when writing this book. Whenever I read an article, I would always reach out to experts. And so I did the same thing when I was writing the book, I reached out to financial planners like you, Dan, and I reached out to estate planning attorneys. I reached out to aging life care specialists. I actually talked to two financial psychologists so that I could get their insight on how to have these tricky conversations. I talked to real people who have had the conversation. I've talked to people who recognize the need for having the conversation, but were afraid to have the conversation. And so I tried to really cover all my bases when writing this book, and gathering, stories and advice, and then sharing my own stories along the way, just to give people as much information as possible, but also to make it approachable. I didn't want to come off as, like it was a textbook. I wanted it to be very actionable advice for people so that they understood what I was explaining them how to do, because financial matters. A lot of people don't understand the basics of personal finance, of estate planning. And so I wanted it to be approachable for people.
That's great. And we see that all the time, especially with clients, our clients who are aging, encouraging them to talk to their children and vice versa, the children reaching out. So when you actually spoke to some of these clients who hadn't had the conversation, what was preventing them? What were some of the reasons they gave to that really, hey, I don't know how to approach it, or what were some of the background?
A couple different fears that surfaced among people. Some people were afraid to have the conversation because it brought up the issue of aging and death, and they didn't want to have to think about the fact that their parents were going to get older and that they were going to die. It's just, they knew it deep down, but talking about it, I think, made it real. And I'm sure you see that with older adults too. They don't want to talk about estate planning because then they have to come to terms with the fact that, yes, they are going to die. And so there were, adult children who didn't want to have to think about having to bring up this touchy issue, really the sad issue with their parents. There were people who knew their parents were struggling financially, and so they didn't want to embarrass them by bringing up the topic, even though they knew that their parents were likely going to reach out to them for some sort of help or financial support even. There were people who were afraid that they were going to make their parents angry because money was just not a topic that was discussed in their family. So they didn't want to, get on their parents' bad side by bringing up a topic that their parents might not want to discuss. All sorts of reasons that people are afraid. But what I realize and what, I told them and what I tell people in my book is that oftentimes you have blown these fears out of proportion.
Yep.
If you approach these conversations the right way, and that is out of love and respect for your parents, most likely they're not going to get mad. They're not going to think that you're being greedy. They're not going to, they're not going to take offense by what you're saying. Like I said, if you approach these conversations out of love and respect. Now, of course, if you go to your parents and say, hey, mom and dad, do you have a will and what am I getting? Or mom and dad, I'm really worried that you're mismanaging your money and I'm going to have to take care of you. That's not going to start the conversation off on the right foot. Everyone's going to get defensive if you're feeling attacked. And so you've got to approach it carefully.
Absolutely. A little tact goes a long way in that scenario. I love how you phrase that. And really, not having these conversations brings a whole host of challenges, right? And you alluded to some of them. Can you talk through a little bit of some of the main issues and challenges that you're going to see? Obviously, being in a situation where things are going to get out of control and they have to step in late. But can you go through a few examples of what you've seen there or heard?
Sure. So, when this topic comes up, I often hear from people, well, we're not there yet. My parents are healthy. They haven't retired or they're still doing well. There's no need to have this conversation. It's that we'll cross that bridge when we come to it mentality. But if you do wait, then there's not going to be a bridge to cross. You are going to be really struggling to swim across this current of emotions from your parents. If there's an emergency, the lack of planning, oftentimes the lack of estate planning documents. And here's the thing that people don't realize. If there is no will, if there's no power of attorney, if there's no healthcare proxy, if there's no living will, and there's already an emergency, your parent has had a stroke, they're no longer able to make decisions for themselves, those documents cannot be drafted and signed at that point. You have to be mentally competent to sign them. They've got to be in place while you are young and healthy. And, I know a lot of people think, oh, estate planning, that's something only rich people do. And that is not true. If you want people to know your wishes, if you care about who gets your money when you die, even if you don't have a lot of money, if you care about who makes financial decisions or healthcare decisions for, if you can't, you've got to put it in writing. Everyone needs estate planning documents. Like I mentioned, you need a will or a trust. It spells out who gets what when you die. You need to make sure your parents have one of those, because if they don't and they think, oh, my kids can just sort it out, that's not true. It is not true. Like state law will determine who gets your property and assets. And if your parents don't put it in writing, you and your siblings or other family members could end up in court fighting over who gets what. You don't want to have to do it. It tears families apart. If your parents also need a power of attorney that spells out who can make financial decisions for them if they can't. And a lot of people think, oh, I don't want to give that much power over to my kids. You just tell your parents, look, make the decision now, put it in writing, put that document someplace safe, and tell me how and when I can access it. If they don't want you to have that much power right away, but if they're naming you their power of attorney, they need to be able to trust you. And so, they should be able to, give you that power whenever. Just trust that you're not going to take advantage of it. They need to name a healthcare proxy. It's also called a healthcare surrogate or a healthcare power of attorney, someone to make medical decisions for them if they can't. Mom has a stroke. She's in the hospital. I can guarantee you the first question they're going to ask you is, are you your mom's healthcare surrogate? Can you make decisions for her? If you can't, they're not going to talk to you. There needs to be in a living will or advance directive spelling out what sort of end-of-life medical treatment they do or do not want, so that you don't have to make that decision. So it's up to them to decide whether they want to be on life support. All these things have to be in place. And so, at the least, you need to find out, do your parents have these estate planning documents? If they don't, you need to encourage them to get them as soon as possible. But then you want to get more details, how do they pay their bills? Because again, if there's an emergency, you need to make sure the bills are getting paid. If they're writing checks, someone has to be named that power of attorney so they can sign checks for them. If they can't, if they're paid online, can you access those accounts if you have to? The more information you get, the better prepared and better able you will be to help them if there is an emergency. Because really the last thing people are going to want to do when there's an emergency is discuss finances. If there's that plan in place, then that's one less thing you have to worry about when something has gone wrong. And if your parents live a very healthy life and pass away, at an old age without any issues, you're still going to have to deal with what's left behind. And again, that's one less thing that you're going to have to struggle to deal with if you already have the details. You can grieve the loss of your parents without worrying, oh my gosh, what do they have? Who's getting what? I don't know what to do.
Yeah, and I have always told clients, a lot of times in the conversation, they say, yes, my parents told me they have these documents. I go, do you know where they are? And I go, because if you don't, and you don't know where to find them, it's basically like not having them. And a lot of times that's where the conversation ends. They ask mom and dad and they go, yes, we have these documents. And they go, oh, okay, that's good. And you're like, and what else did you get out of that conversation? So I try to point that out to people is maybe you should actually have a copy of it. Because if there is that emergency, as you mentioned, mom or dad goes into the hospital and they go, "Are you power of attorney?" And you go, "Well, they said I was."
That
And
doesn't work, I don't
they
think.
go, "Okay, but do you actually have the document that names you as that person?" And you go, "Well, it's in their house somewhere." It's like
And it's
that.
really not going to work at the bank. If
No.
True.
something has happened and you go in and you say, "Hey, I need to sign some checks for my mom. She's naming her power of attorney." And they say, "Do you have the document?" And then you say what you just said, "Oh, it's in the house." They're not going to let you have any access. They've got to see that document. They're
Yeah, the
not going to
physical
take your
document.
word for it because they've got to protect their customer.
Right.
I'll tell you an interesting story. Literally just happened this week with my own mother. Her power of attorney had one witness. The bank says, no good, we require two. So here we go, having to go back and I always tell clients, I know Dan, we always tell clients, your POA is great that you have drawn up by the attorney, but for your banks, go see if they have their own document because each bank is very different and they could require two signature witnesses. There's all types of things that specifically when it comes to that day-to-day cash, you got to be prepared for.
Right. And oftentimes, it'll people do encounter hurdles when they go to the bank, and so again, I would point out it's a good idea to make sure your parents are actually working with an attorney. There are, free and low cost documents you can download from the web, but that power of attorney document in particular, if you do work with an attorney or if your parents work with an attorney and there are issues when you have to go to the bank and you have to start acting as their agent, you get that attorney on the phone with the bank and the attorney's going to say, "Hey, this is a legally drafted document. You have to accept it."
So knowing all the documents is great, right? And having an idea of what those documents are. But I think the book and really as you mentioned earlier, the psychology of dealing with this is completely different than, hey, just have some documents in place. What did you see, in your research and in your personal experience a little bit was what are some of the hurdles that you have to overcome with having these conversations? What are ideas that you can utilize or people listening can utilize to help in that conversation so that they can get these things sort of the conversation started and moving forward?
One of the things that I suggest in the book is if you think your parents are going to be reluctant to talk with you, it's a good idea to pinpoint in advance why they might be reluctant. So if you know that money has always been an off limits topic in your house, don't start the conversation by talking about money. Make it more general. Maybe you ask your parents, "How's retirement going? Is it everything you expected it to be?" And then you have to keep asking questions. They might say, "Oh, it's great." And they might say, "We've been able to travel a lot." And then you say something like, "Yeah, you must have done a really good job of planning and saving money." Keep the conversation going, so that you can slowly start to get more information over time. Or, another good way, if you know your parents are reluctant to talk about money, is you can talk about scams, because guess what? We are all targeted by scammers. This is a great way to start the conversation. You can say, "Hey, I just got a call from someone claiming to be," and this is actually a scam that is circulating right now. "I just got a call from someone claiming to be with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, telling me that I was due some money from a class action lawsuit and I needed to pay some taxes up front to collect my legal winnings." Mom and Dad, this is a scam. CFPB is not going to call you up and claim that you have to pay taxes or fees up front to collect winnings. So you can use an example of a scam that has been targeted toward you or that you've read about in the news to start that conversation going, and then you have that conversation about scams. Maybe you let them know about another one. Then you let them know about something else you've heard about to keep the conversation going. If you think that your parents are worried about aging and death, don't start the conversation by talking about those estate planning documents. Find something else to start the conversation out with. If you think that they're embarrassed about how they've managed their finances, you certainly don't want them to feel embarrassed by pointing out mistakes that they have made. You can share some of the things that you've done. Maybe you say, "Hey, I have tried a retirement savings calculator online and I found that it was really great? Or did you know that the Social Security Administration offers a way to keep tabs of your benefits online if you create a My Social Security account? Figure out why they might balk at the conversation and use a different approach so that you're, again, not starting it off on the wrong foot. If you're still relatively young, a great way to start these conversations is to ask your parents for advice, because parents love to give their kids advice. And so you could say, hey, I just got married. Does that mean that I need life insurance? And, should I have estate planning documents? Do I need a will now that I'm married? Their answer is going to give you clues about what they've done. And then you keep asking questions. Oh, well, you don't have a will either. Maybe we should look into whether we should get one. Maybe we can all make an appointment to go to an attorney together and do this. It can be a family thing. Again, keep asking questions. This is not a one-time only conversation. And the benefit of trying to have these conversations sooner rather than later is that some parents are going to remain reluctant for a while. Unfortunately, some parents, it might take years to get them comfortable enough to share information. But if you keep trying, slowly chipping away at it, you're going to find a way to get that foot in the door. And then once that door opens, then you can start to have more and more conversations. Most parents, though, are not going to be as reluctant as you might think. You might have parents who say to you, oh my gosh, I'm so glad you asked this question because I've been meaning to talk to you about this.
Yeah, they were reluctant. The parent was reluctant as well.
Sure.
And they just didn't know it potentially. Or the kids didn't know that mom and dad, or mom or dad, or whoever it is, was reluctant to have that conversation. And just by bringing it up, it, makes things a whole lot easier. So as you mentioned, this could be a conversation that just doesn't happen once. It could be multiple times. Do you think that's what prevents kids from wanting to really deal with? Because if you've done something multiple times and nothing comes out of it with, in a difficult situation, sometimes you just get a little frustrated and just throw your hands up and go, okay, I'm done. But, what's the risk? We sort of talked about the risk there, but what do you see that risk as being?
I get it. If you've kind of built it up in your head as this isn't going to go well, and you're telling yourself that, then yes, it probably won't go well if you tried and your parents aren't budging. Then at that point, you might want to try a different tactic. If you're not getting anywhere yourself with your parents, maybe you can get one of your other siblings to try to have the conversation. In fact, you should be talking to your siblings before you even talk to your parents, so that you guys can all get on the same page and decide who's going to initiate the conversation. Is it one of you, all of you, when you're going to do it? But if you haven't done that already, talk to your siblings, see if they have ideas. Reach out to a third party. And that might mean reaching out to your parents' financial advisor if they're already working with a financial professional. Maybe it's their accountant. Maybe it's their attorney if they have an attorney, and asking that person to encourage your parents to have some conversations with you. Maybe it's reaching out to a family friend. Maybe it's reaching out to a clergy member, reaching out to someone at their church or their synagogue or their place of worship, and asking that person, someone they respect, to encourage them to have some conversations. Maybe it's reaching out to another family member. Maybe Aunt Sally, has done a great job of planning and has had those conversations with her kids. And so you ask Aunt Sally, hey, could you encourage mom and dad to have some conversations, to share at least a little bit of information? If that's not going to work either, then something else you can do is to ask your parents to write down information for you. Because oftentimes this is a matter of control, and your parents don't want to give up control. No one wants to give up control.
Sure.
And so they see this as a role reversal. They see this as, you wanting to come in and take over, or at least take over as soon as they show that they are starting to forget things. And so you say, look, I get it. It's difficult to share this information, but what would be really helpful is if you can make a list. make a list of your accounts, make a list of your sources of income. If the accounts are online, usernames and passwords, put that list someplace safe along with those estate planning documents that you hopefully have, and tell me when and how I can access that list. And that lets them maintain control, but you know the information is there so that you can access it if you have to.
What have you seen works, or some thoughts on it would be great if all families all get along and like each other, but we know that that doesn't always happen in the dynamic. Some children, siblings don't get along. There's challenges with the parent-child dynamic. Maybe one child's not as connected as some of the other siblings. What are your thoughts or recommendations on, hey, how do you approach this? And you can't get everybody on the same page, but again, we know the importance of having these documents in place, because the biggest challenge is not being able to carry out the wishes for your parents, and this could really have ramifications down the road.
So like I said, it's a good idea to call a family meeting with your siblings if you have siblings before talking to mom and dad. Let them know that you think it would be a good idea to have a conversation with mom and dad, or mom or dad, depending on your, whether both parents are living, whether they're married or remarried, divorced. So you're going to tell your siblings, we need to have this conversation. You're going to decide, hey, is it going to be one of us? Is it going to be all of us? And you want to encourage your siblings, hey, look, I know we haven't always gotten along, if that's the case, but we got to think about mom and dad. And we've got to do what's right for them. And if we can have this conversation with mom and dad and put a plan in place, that's going to make things easier for us as they get older. It's going to limit the arguments. We're not going to panic when something happens, because we're all going to be on the same page. You're going to talk to your siblings about what roles you're willing to play as your parents get older. Hey, I live close to mom and dad. I'll be willing to drive them to their doctor's appointments. But maybe if you're going to be willing to help out with the financial side of things, you can be the one to negotiate with their creditors, and you can be the one to, sign documents for them if necessary. I mean, at the end of the day, it's up to the parents to decide. But if you can at least try to get your siblings on board and go to your parents as a united force. Now, if you've got siblings who don't want to participate in these conversations, who aren't interested in being involved with your parents' lives, that's okay. You don't want to force it, but I would encourage you to keep them updated on how the conversation went, because you never know when they're going to come back and say, hey, yep, I want to be involved now. And I feel like you're keeping me out of the loop. You're going behind my back to do things, okay? And that's why you want to talk to your siblings up front, because if you do go to your parents without telling them, they might think that you are going behind their back so that you can get in good with mom and dad and get everything when they die. So you want to eliminate any suspicion. You want to eliminate the potential for fights. They can still happen, but if you can be upfront and open the lines of communication, it's better. No, will it go perfectly for everyone? It will not, but taking these steps increases the potential for things going at least better than you might think. Parents who are balking, again, you don't ever want to threaten your parents. You don't want to ever say something like, look, if you're not going to talk to me, I'm not going to help you. But sometimes people don't realize the consequences of not sharing information, of not planning. And so you don't want to, again, scare them, but if you have a story that you can share, hey, do you remember what happened when Uncle Teddy died and he died without a will and all those kids started fighting over who got what? Or, hey, I've got a colleague at work whose mom now has Alzheimer's disease, and she had not been named her mom's power of attorney. She had not been named her healthcare surrogate. And you know what? She had to go to court. She essentially had to put her mom on trial to prove that she was no longer competent to manage her own finances. This cost her money, It cost her mom money because they both had to hire attorneys, and she had to go through this court process to be named her mom's conservator, to be named her guardian. They could have avoided this if they had simply had those estate planning documents in place. The thing is, we don't know what we don't know. And most people don't realize that your kids can't just log onto your bank accounts and make transactions for you. They don't realize that they're going to have to go to court to be named a conservator if you haven't named them a power of attorney. They don't realize that they're going to have to go to court and duke it out over who gets what, potentially, if there's no will or there's no trust, And so making your parents aware of the consequences might open their eyes more to the benefits of having these conversations.
And with the challenges of more and more people living longer because of better healthcare and medical advances, we're seeing way more cases of dementia and Alzheimer's. And what you alluded to is by waiting, you may have closed that window of being able to get these documents in place. And not only that, but also being able to put your wishes in writing, which is a challenge.
Right. And I think that's something that's really important to point out to your parents is like, I get it. You're independent now, and I want you to remain as independent as long as possible. I don't want to have to help manage your finances at any point. But if you are concerned about how your finances are managed, if you want us to do things the way you would want them to be done, you got to let us know. You got to tell us. If you end up needing care, you've got to tell us what sort of care you want. We want to know what your wishes are so that we can honor them. Absolutely. If we don't know what your wishes are, we're going to guess. And we might do things the way that you don't want us to do them. No parent wants to hear that. No parent wants to hear, oh my gosh, my kids are going to come in and wreck all this hard work I've put into saving because they have no idea how to manage my finances, or my kids are going to, throw me into a nursing home, the first sign of memory loss, and I don't want that to happen. And so, if you can make it very clear to your parents that you need to know what their wishes are so you can honor them, hopefully that's going to open their eyes to the benefits of these conversations. People don't think about that. We don't want to think about getting older. We don't want to think about dying. But, a lot of us want to maintain control. And the best way to do that is to let people know what your wishes are.
Well, I often have the conversation with clients who are dragging their feet potentially on these documents. I go, okay, do you want your children to bathe you when you can't? And they go, what? I go, well, this might be the reality if we don't have something in place, because if you don't tell them that you want to age in home or where you want to be or those types of things, and there's nothing in place, this might be your reality. And usually that, having some of that, you hate to do it, but the kind of shock of, okay, wait a minute, I don't want that at all kind of scenario.
And that is such an important conversation to have at some point when you're having these conversations is what sort of care do you want if you need it? And I can guarantee you that 99% of parents are going to say, I want to be cared for in my home and I want family to take care of me. But the reality is that's not always possible. Their home might not be set up for them to age in place, and family might not be able to provide the care that they need. Maybe dad expects mom to take care of them, but dad might not be thinking about the fact that when he's 90 years old and mom is 87, how is she going to help him get up and down the stairs? How is she going to help him bathe? How is she going to help him get dressed every morning and get undressed at night? She's not going to have the physical or the emotional strength to do it. And so maybe that means the kids have to step in, but the kids might have their own kids to take care of. They can't quit their jobs to take care of dad. And so there needs to be a plan to pay for professional care if possible. problem is professional care is very expensive. Most people think Medicare is going to pay for it, and surprise, it
Nope.
doesn't. It
No,
doesn't, so if your parents are middle class, there's no way they can afford to pay for long-term care from someone coming into the house or in an assisted living facility or a nursing home. There are steps that they can take in advance to potentially qualify for Medicaid to help cover their cost of long-term care. If your dad was a veteran, he might qualify for veterans benefits to help pay for long-term care. Spouse of a veteran can potentially qualify for veterans benefits to pay for long-term care. But you've got to know that these benefits exist. You've got to have a plan for using them. If you're trying to scramble at the last minute to put a plan together, then you have a lot fewer options. And so these conversations have to be addressed too. And they're probably the most difficult, but they're so important because if your parents don't have a plan for long-term care, then guess what? You are likely their long-term care plan.
Yeah. And it's important to point out that each state, because Medicare is a state-run program, that it varies state by state. Great, great points.
so just one last thing. You get them to say yes to, hey, I'll put these documents together. And then because they don't want to upset anybody, they want to name all 5 kids as power of attorney, as executor, as also being able to make medical decisions. And on the other hand, what should these kids understand the amount of work that will go into? It's easy to say, hey, yeah, sure, I'll be your executor, but there is work involved. It's not like you just snap your fingers and it's done. So can you speak to both of those things of, multiple beneficiaries, because I don't want to upset any of the children, and what is the actual work that's involved there?
Sure. So for starters, anyone who's an adult child out there listening, do not feel insulted if your parents don't want to name you their power of attorney and they want to name another sibling. You are not missing out on some
Nope.
grand prize at all. But if you have multiple siblings and your parents want to name all of you as financial power of attorney and healthcare power of attorney, this is so, so important. And if they have a good attorney, the attorney will do this. That document needs to specify that all of you can act independently of each other. This is so important because if you can't, then that means that anytime one of the agents under power of attorney gets on the phone with your parents' bank, then guess what? All of you have to, because they can't make a decision alone. It can't just be their signature. All of you have to sign. And so it just creates additional hurdles. And so that language needs to be in your parents' estate planning documents, that if there are multiple agents, multiple people who can make decisions for them, they need to be able to act independently of each other. A good attorney will make sure that's the case. A good attorney is also going to probably encourage those parents not to name all 5 children. They're going to say, okay, let's pick 1 or 2. Maybe one kid's the power of attorney, the other one is the healthcare surrogate. Maybe the third kid gets to be the executor, or you can have co-executors or co-trustees. But that's really important. If you are named your parents' power of attorney, you definitely need to get information about their finances so that if you have to step into that role, you know what sort of accounts they have and that you can access those accounts. You know where the checkbooks are. If you are executor, you need to know everything. You need to know everything about their finances, because if you don't, you're playing detective. You're going through their drawers, you're going through the attic, you're going through the garage, you're going through shoe boxes to find evidence of the accounts that they have, because you're going to have to provide an accounting of everything to the court so that that account can be settled during the probate process. If there's a will, you still have to go through what is called the probate process to settle everything. If there's a trust, you can avoid that. But the trust has to be set up correctly. All those assets have to be titled in the name of the trust. Otherwise, the trust doesn't do you any good. But if you're the executor, like I said, you've got to know all the details. Financial power of attorney, the more information you have, the better. And like I said, you've got to be able to access those accounts. As my mom's financial power of attorney, her healthcare power of attorney, her executor, I managed all of her finances for her after she was unable to in the middle and late stages of Alzheimer's disease. But I had to get involved even sooner because even in the early stage of Alzheimer's disease, you're making money mistakes. You're at risk of being exploited by scammers. And so if there's been that diagnosis of any sort of dementia, someone's got to be involved right away to keep tabs on that parent's finances, whether it's, the spouse, if there's another spouse, it's the kids, it's a family member, someone has got to be keeping an eye on that person's finances. But it's a big job, and if you don't feel comfortable stepping into that role, then don't raise your hand and say, pick me, pick me. Maybe you've got another sibling who's willing to do it instead. Maybe there's another family member, maybe your parents have nieces and nephews who might be better suited for the role. But if you are the only child and it's going to fall on you, don't be afraid to get help. Maybe you encourage your parents to go meet with a financial advisor and you go to that meeting also so that you can work together and create a plan if you're not comfortable helping your parents plan. Maybe it's meeting with an accountant, even meeting with an elder law attorney to get some advice, going online and reading articles from a reputable source, not Joe's blog. The Consumer Financial Protection Board has guides to managing other people's money. My book walks you through a lot of the information that you need. And so there are resources out there. A lot of them are free. Some of them cost money. Not an astronomical amount, but it's worth spending the money to get trusted information. But that's what I would encourage you to do.
Fabulous. So you did mention your book, so we will highlight again. Great book, has lots of good details of how to start that conversation and scenarios that you've alluded to. So we would encourage, and you could reach out to us as Dan being quoted there. We do have several copies. So great book, you've all read. And Cameron, this was fabulous. Thank you for coming on and helping us walk through kind of the scenarios and how to have these conversations and what the challenges are, because I think the biggest part of the issue is getting the conversation started and how to do that.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, if you enjoyed this podcast, please, and you enjoyed the video, please click like and share with, anybody, friends, family, especially on this topic. I think it applies to everybody, more so than some of the other things that we talk about. If you'd like a copy of Cameron's book, the first 10 people who email us at info@vlpfa.com, just send us a made-up name, but some address to send the book, and we'll send you the book. There's no obligation. I just find this is very useful information, and hopefully we can get the word out a little bit more about the book and all the great things in it.
Yep. And thanks again for joining us. And again, more resources are available on our website at vlpfa.com and our social media. And we look forward to having more great speakers just like Cameron in the future. Thanks, Cameron.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Live Great Review. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to our podcast on iTunes or Spotify and recommend our podcast to family and friends. To learn more about VLP Financial Advisors, please check out our website at vlpfa.com. Thanks again.
And now for our necessary disclosures. Securities and advisor services offered through Cetera Advisor Networks, LLC, member FINRA SIPC, a broker-dealer and registered investment advisor. All investing involves risk, including the possible loss of principal. There is no assurance that any investment strategy will be successful. The views stated in this podcast are not necessarily the opinion of Cetera Advisor Networks, LLC, and should not be construed directly or indirectly as an offer to buy or sell any securities mentioned. Due to the volatility with the markets mentioned, opinions are subject to change without notice. Information is based on sources believed to be reliable. However, their accuracy or completeness cannot be guaranteed. Past performance does not guarantee future results.